The most confident picks comes through. The lock of the week comes through. The underdog of the week does not come through, but Ramirez Brahimov gets it done and dropped his nuts on Austin Vanderford like I said he would. Something else I want to mention, guys, if you saw the way that I broke down the Yuri and Khalil fight, it went exactly the way I said it would. You know, the way I said Yuri would eventually walk him down with that chaotic style mixed along with his head movement. I said we might see something like the way Alex Pereira finished Khalil, but I said Yuri would get touched up a bit more and get hit more in the process. That's literally exactly what happened. You know, he got the knockout in the third round, like we said he would, and you know, Yusuf Zalal, he dropped his nuts on Emmett. That was spectacular. I thought he'd win by decision, and I was getting kind of worried throughout the week about that fight going under 2.5 because Zalal was saying how he wanted to finish Emmett, and that's exactly what he did. You know, I didn't even want to do the over 2.5. Like, I swear, I wanted to do the money line. I should have stuck with my gut, but it's all good though. You know, the Yuri and Pfeiffer parlay, that was a fun one too. Both get the knockout, the easy knockout parlay. So let's continue on with these picks. Hope y'all are doing well. Welcome to this week's prediction episode for UFC Rio, Charles Oliveira versus Mateusz Gamrot, where I'll be breaking down and predicting every fight on the card. Let's dive into the first fight of the night, where we got Beatriz Mosquito versus Irina Alekseeva. So I'm gonna go with Beatriz Mosquito to win this fight. You know, we have the 34-year-old prospect, undefeated prospect Beatriz, making her UFC debut versus Irina Alekseeva, who's Irina. She's had 3 fights in the UFC. You know, she's lost 2 of them, and just by looking at the records, you know, I feel the obvious choice has to be Beatriz, right? Then you look at the height and realize Beatrice is going to be around 5 inches shorter, which can be a concern. But if you look at Beatrice's last fight, she fought someone who's 5'11", who was also undefeated. You know, sorry, Beatrice had about 8 to 9 inch height disadvantage. You know, she had an 8 to 9 inch height disadvantage, and she still TKO'd her in the second round. And I watched that fight, and she looked pretty good. You know, she was circling around the octagon, had a great reaction times to move out of the way of punches. You know, she used her striking, her overhand in particular, to close the distance and drag her opponent to the ground within the first minute of the fight. And once she had her opponent on the ground, you know, it was game over. You know, she is so dominant on top, and she knows how to maintain that top control. And in the second round, the same thing. You know, circled around the octagon, threw nice leg kicks, gets the takedown, and maintains heavy top control and throws some nasty ground and pound. You know, I like what I saw, and she never engaged in the brawl. You know, she fought smart and she stuck to a great game plan. I see a lot of people saying they don't rate her striking highly, but I thought she did pretty well. You know, she knows what she's doing. She's not engaging in brawls. She strikes from the outside. She knows how to close the distance. And you know, with Irina Alekseeva, one thing I instantly noticed about her is her striking defense isn't good. You know, right? She doesn't move her head at all. You know, she comes forward. She only eats jabs all night. Her leg kicks are kind of soft, but she does have some power in her hands. You know, she dropped Melissa Mullins in the first round when she timed a nice right hand down the middle, and she still lost that fight because she was eating so many punches throughout the fight, never moving her head, getting taken down. And I don't think it'll be easy to time a nice right hand like that on Beatrice, who's always circling around and managing distance and never engaging in a brawl. You know, and in Irina's last fight, you know, it was bad. You know, she got dominated in the striking. She got dropped, got taken down by someone who many thought was considered to be low level competition. So I think Beatrice has the higher ceiling for sure. And her grappling looks elite. You know, she's smart on the feet, but still she has limited experience. But coming up against Irina, I think she'll be fine. You know, Irina is mostly a grappler herself, but she has a tough time finding success getting the fights to the ground. You know, she's usually the one getting taken down and controlled. And on the feet, I have no doubt that Beatrice will be the smarter fighter, you know, because Irina gets hit way too often and she's okay with getting into brawls while Beatrice fights smart. You know, I think Beatrice will find success in getting those takedowns. And once she has Irina on the ground, Beatrice has some nasty ground and pound, you know, which can lead to a finish because it's hard to get up after getting taken down by Beatrice. So she does a good job holding you down. And Irina is going to try and use her wild striking to set up her own takedowns, and she's gonna have to make it ugly. But I see Beatrice moving around, not getting touched too often, avoiding the heavy shots and being the one who dictates where the fight takes place. So the pick has to be Beatrice. She's compact, she's a smart grappler with heavy top pressure control, and she has sharp distance management. While Alekseeva, she's only a wild striker, really poor head movement, and she has sloppy entries, and she's vulnerable to takedowns. So I'm gonna say that Beatrice circles around, counters, drags her to the ground, and dominates on top. Moving on to our next fight, we have Julia Polastri versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz. Kowalkiewicz. The pick is Julia Polastri. So Karolina, she is pretty old nowadays. She hasn't been performing too well recently. She never really performed well in the UFC. She used to be on a 5-fight losing streak, then went on to put together a 4-fight win streak against fellow old unathletic women fighters in the UFC, but now back to a 2-fight losing streak because she's fighting young, hungry, athletic fighters again. And here with Julia, being much younger and much more skilled than her, I can't see Carolina winning this one either. Julia is pretty good. She's losing to fighters like Jasmine Jastovicius and Lupita Godinez. Like these fighters are really tough that she's losing to. Julia seems to be able to take care of anyone that is average or fighters that aren't a prospect, and Julia can beat them because she's well above average. And Carolina is definitely on the decline in her career when it comes to fighting decent opposition, and she never really shined ever in the UFC. Coming up against Julia, who's a skilled, aggressive fighter with clean technique on the feet and who's also a threat on the ground. I think Julia is going to be too gritty for her and push a pace on her and too willing to win. Carolina kind of has a similar style, aggressive and pushing the pace type of style, but she gets hit often, and fighting someone who's much younger than her, we've seen her have trouble with the athleticism of fighters. In Julia's last fight with Lupita Godinez, she was having trouble with Lupita's grappling early on in the fight, but in the third round, Julia was still in the fight, pushing the pace, landing on her, and still trying to win. And I think the difference with Carolina is that as the fight goes on, I think she'll start to slow down in a matchup like this. During her 5-fight losing streak, she struggled a lot with fighters who were able to dictate the pace and overwhelm her. Even Carolina herself, in 2019, she said, in quote, in 2019, in quote, she said, the best years and the top of the form are behind. And that was 6 years ago. She was saying 6 years ago that her prime is well past behind her. So imagine like nowadays, she has probably no belief in herself, right? So I think this is going to be mostly a stand-up battle. But the more accurate and aggressive fighter, the one who will be landing more and pushing the pace, will be Julia. And Carolina also doesn't have the best striking defense. Against someone who's going to pressure her with strikes, I can see her getting hit often, and ultimately that's being that she's 38 years old and doesn't fight to a high level, and she's fighting someone who's eager to make a stamp in the division like Julia, it's she's most likely going to get ran through. Pulaski is much younger, much more aggressive. She's got the cleaner boxing. She has a gritty pace to her, and she has pretty strong cardio herself. Carolina, she's 38 years old, right? She's hittable, declining in her speed and her durability. So I think Julia's gonna push a pace on her, overwhelms the older veteran with volume and youth. Moving on to our next fight, we're going to be breaking down Lucas Rocha versus Stewart Nicoll. I think that's how you say it. My pick is going to be Stewart Nicoll. And this was a tough one. Both guys lost their UFC debut, and they both fought some decent opposition. Lucas Rocha fought Clayton Carpenter, who's a pretty good prospect himself. Clayton gave Tagir Ulanbekov a good fight. And when Rocha fought Carpenter, Rocha was landing on him, landing right hands on Carpenter, landing spinning back kicks on Carpenter, flying knees. And like Rocha's striking looked really good, right? But he was getting taken down by the bigger guy and couldn't get back up to his feet, which is what led him to getting submitted, which is what led Lucas Rocha getting submitted by Clayton Carpenter. That he got taken down by the bigger guy and then submitted. But, when Stewart Nicoll lost his debut, he was pretty much winning that whole fight, using his wrestling, going for submissions, landing ground and pound, and then As his opponent tried to get up, Stewart pretty much falls off of his opponent's back because he was too high up, right? And then instantly gets caught in a guillotine. It was kind of unlucky because he was pretty much dominating the wrestling exchanges, but also it was a really slick and sneaky submission from his opponent to do that. You know, he saw an opportunity, didn't hesitate whatsoever, instantly jumps on Stewart's neck and guillotines him, you know, puts him to sleep. And that loss was to Jesus Aguilar, you know, and Jesus Aguilar, that loss has aged pretty well. You know, he seems to be a great fighter nowadays, you know, and usually Stewart, he's known for his dominant wrestling, you know, which he was able to showcase in that fight with Aguilar, but he got caught in the guillotine, right? And when it comes to Lucas Rocha's previous fights, he's known mostly for his striking, you know, being able to land those quick flying knees, those flashy spinning kicks. It's the wrestling defense that usually gets him in trouble. So I do think Stewart's wrestling is strong enough to get him on the ground and work his top game, you know. While it's on the feet though, Rocha is going to be dangerous, and his knees, they're strong and they're powerful, you know. But Rocha is he has a pretty small frame, and if you got a small frame, you need to be able to defend those takedowns and have some ground game in your arsenal. But Rocha, he gets taken down and he gets held down from strong grapplers, and Stewart is a strong grappler, strong enough to close the distance and work his way into getting those takedowns, and from there he can land some ground and pound. So while Rocha is a flashy striker, he has those nice flying knees and spinning kicks, he has weak takedown defense. And coming up against a solid wrestler like Stewart, who has heavy top control, he can grind, but he is vulnerable to getting submitted, you know, if he's not careful, right? I'm not gonna bank on a quick submission victory for Lucas Rocha, like what happened in Stewart's last fight. I'm gonna pick Stewart to win this fight using his wrestling to control and edging out the rounds, possibly finding a submission as well. Moving on to our next fight, we got the battle of the mid, Luan Lacerda versus Saimon Oliveira. I'm gonna go with Luan Lacerda here. So this is a really low level fight. You know, both guys have struggled heavily in the UFC. Saimon Oliveira is 0-3 and Luan is 0-2. You know, I remember in the lead up to the fight with Saimon Oliveira's last fight, everyone was saying his opponent David Martinez is going to knock him out because of how bad Oliveira is, and also because of how good David Martinez is, you know, and that's exactly what happened. You know, I was saying David Martinez was going to knock him out, and Saimon got absolutely destroyed in the first round. And that was his second knockout loss in a row. You know, both knockout losses came from good opposition, you know, by David Martinez in his last fight, and before that to Daniel Marcos. But before those two losses, he lost to a below average UFC fighter. So Oliveira was really never that good. And to be knocked out back to back really shows that as well. You know, losing to low level competition before those two knockouts, not the best look, you know. But same with his opponent here, you know, Luan, coming off of two losses in the UFC. Most recent one lost to Damone Blackshear by TKO. You know, a pretty decent fighter, but before that fight, he also lost to a below average UFC fighter as well, you know. So based off of their wins though, I feel as though Saimon Oliveira, he might be more dangerous on the feet. 18 wins, only 2 decision wins. You know, he has 5 by knockout, 11 by submissions, meaning when he wins, he's usually finishing fights. And Luan, 10 out of his 12 wins are by submission and only 2 decisions, but no knockouts on his record, you know, meaning he's finishing fights as well, but mostly on the ground, which shows he isn't so dangerous on the feet. I think on the feet, Oliveira has him beat. You know, he likes to come forward and strike, but if Luan goes for takedowns, I feel like he can get them. You know, I feel like he can get them. He's not active with his takedowns enough for me to be confident that he'll actually get them. But at the same time, I don't think Oliveira is dangerous enough to knock out Luan. You know, despite Luan standing in front of his opponents the whole time and not really moving his head, you know, I didn't really want to pick a winner here because they're both really low level fighters and none of them have shined enough to give me confidence in either of them. But I'm gonna say Luan. Excuse me. I just burped. I'm gonna say Luan is skilled enough on the feet, to compete with someone like Saimon Oliveira, and he will occasionally go for takedowns, which can give him the edge here. You know, Luan has some strong entries. You know, and if he gets a hold of you, he can really get you to the ground. So I'm gonna say it'll be a back and forth fight in the striking. No one really in any serious danger for the whole fight, and I don't see Oliveira landing anything significant. And when things start to heat up for Luan, he could go for a takedown or press Saimon Oliveira up against the fence, eventually wear down Saimon with the wrestling. When Luan strikes, it's really low level. He has no footwork at all. He stays stationary, doesn't move his head. But I don't think Saimon Oliveira is dangerous enough to capitalize on that. Luan is a tough guy. He likes to come forward, but he gets hit often. The thing I like about Luan the most, though, is that he will occasionally go for takedowns, and when he does, his takedowns are strong. If he gets a hold of you, he can definitely get you to the ground. He might not hold you there for too long, but he can for sure keep going for those takedowns if he chooses to. And with Saimon Oliveira, Oliveira is a tad bit more aggressive on the feet. He comes forward as well, but his shots seem, I don't know who has the power advantage here. He goes for a ton of spinning attacks, Oliveira. He rarely ever lands them. He's active with his leg kicks. He likes to pressure forward, and he will shoot for takedowns as well at times, but it's not his main focus. I'm going to say it's a competitive fight on the feet, and Luan goes for takedowns, and that's what gives him the edge here, and he just does more to win this fight, because Oliveira, he's a wild pressure striker. He's got some good leg kicks, but I'm not a big fan of his fight IQ. He has poor defense, and Lacerda, he's limited on the feet, but the thing that makes me want to choose him is his takedowns. He's got really strong entries and solid top control. So I'm gonna say that he mixes in those takedowns when the fight gets edgy, and that's what gives him the edge here. When both fighters they're competitive on the feet, the one who's doing more, the one who's going for takedowns, it's better look for the judges. I'm gonna say he wears down Oliveira in the clinch exchanges and does more to win the fight. Moving on from this terrible matchup, terrible low level fight, we got Vitor Petroni versus Thomas Peterson. I'm going Vitor Petroni. It's funny because look at them. Never mind. I mean, look at Thomas Peterson, bro. And then look at Vitor Petroni. I can already see Vitor Petroni getting a knockout win here. The guy's an absolute tank, which is sad because Thomas Peterson, as a guy, he's a great guy. The thing about Thomas Peterson is his opponent. No, as his opponent, Thomas Peterson's not bad as a fighter. He's a good fighter. But I think Vitor is a level ahead of him. He'll be more athletic and more dangerous here. I'm sure everyone knows Thomas Peterson. He has a second job as a mechanic or something like that. So it's not really his main focus. While Vitor Petroni, he seems a lot more dedicated to the game, a lot more willing to devote his life to this and get the win. Thomas Peterson, his game plan is to come forward, try to take you down over and over. That's pretty much his game plan every time he steps in there. And it works when your opponent is also slow and fat and slobby. But when someone can move in and out, hit you with some good shots, have a decent ground game, he's shown to fold towards those guys. And I think Vitor is going to be probably the most athletic fighter he's ever faced. The guy is built like a tank, and he hits like a truck. And his most recent fight, he's shown that he can take you down and submit you, which is what he did to Austin Lane, in the first round. And Vitor, he's a good fighter. He's made some mistakes in his career in those two losses that he has, getting caught in the guillotine after shooting for a takedown on Anthony Smith. And then after that, I believe, after that, he got KO'd after not being defensively safe late in the third round versus Dustin Jacoby in a fight that he was winning. I feel like he's made the mistakes he needed to make to now finally start moving on to being a real contender in this division. He's got powerful striking, strong grappling, really athletic, moves well for his size, and he has taken his composure to the next level. He understands the game more now. And I feel like he's a dangerous contender at this stage in his career. Now fighting Thomas Peterson, who's got some strong grappling, heavy hands as well, and can put up an aggressive pace. I just don't know if it'll be enough to beat someone like Vitor Petroni. I can see Petroni being the one who dictates where the fight goes. Using his strength and his athleticism, land some clean shots on the feet, and control the clinch. Uses his takedown defense maybe to reverse position if he gets taken down and land some ground and pound. Thomas needs a takedowns here. It's his usual game plan, and I think he's gonna have a tough time getting the takedowns, getting the fight to the ground. And once his takedowns are stuffed, he's in for a long night, eating heavy shots all night or getting knocked out because Petroni packs some serious power. He's an explosive athlete, serious knockout power, strong defensive wrestling, and he's coming along great as a fighter nowadays. Peterson, he's a pure wrestler. I think his entries are going to be a bit too predictable, and when he gets his takedown stuffed, it's pretty much game over for him. He tends to fold under fights that he can't get the takedowns. And Vitor Petroni, I think he's going to be able to stuff those shots, land bombs on the feet, and likely get a first round knockout here. Moving on to our next fight, we got a fun scrap. Jafel Filho versus Clayton Carpenter. I'm gonna go Clayton Carpenter here. So both guys coming off of a loss to pretty decent competition. Clayton lost to Tagir Ulanbekov and Filho lost to Alan Nascimento. I predicted both guys to lose in those matchups. Tagir is a great fighter, and Clayton, he really made him work for it. And Clayton, he has some nice striking. He even had top control in that fight versus Tagir, but Tagir's wrestling, it's on a whole other level, right? And when Filho lost to Allen, I knew Allen had some crazy scrambling abilities. Like, if he got taken down, his ability to swarm out of there in reverse position was high level, and that's what he was able to do against Filho, which is impressive because Filho, he has some heavy top pressure when he does get you down, and I feel like Clayton's striking in this matchup, I think it's going to be a tad bit cleaner. As Filho throws really aggressively, and every shot he throws is like loading up with power. I think in the wrestling exchanges here, they're going to be competitive. I can see both guys landing takedowns on each other, but as the fight goes on, I feel Filho might start to get tired and break down more easily than Clayton, who's going to be able to continue to push the pace. And when Filho gets hit with shots, he doesn't react well to them. I think Clayton will be more durable and driven when things get ugly, whereas Filho might not be as much as a dog in those tough moments. I don't see Filho being a top contender, but I can see Clayton putting together a nice win streak in this division. Clayton striking, it's going to be much more dominant here, I feel, and he has championship Muay Thai. He has a championship Muay Thai background. He can set a dominant pace on the feet. And his ground game is high level as well. If he gets taken down, he's throwing up submissions, reversing positions, and that's going to be key here because Filho is going to try to take him down. But I'm not that big of a believer in Filho. Filho has decent striking. Excuse me. And he's well-rounded, but I can see Carpenter just setting the pace for this fight. Wearing down Filho, scrambling out of positions to land on the top position, and utilize cleaner striking throughout the fight. So, while Filho does have that heavy top pressure, he throws all his shots with too much power, and I feel like that's going to be a bit predictable for Clayton Carpenter. Even though Carpenter does get hit at times, I think Filho is going to eventually start to fade while Clayton gets stronger as the fight goes on. Because Clayton, he has that dog in him. He has that cleaner striking. He has elite scrambles as well, And I think his cardio and his composure in those tough moments are better than Filho's. So I think Clayton's going to be good at scrambling. He's going to be able to outpace Filho with volume and speed as well, So, and he comes from a great gym. What's the gym? It's where like Sean O'Malley, Marcus McGee trains. It's not coming to me, but he comes from a great gym as well, Clayton Carpenter. Moving on. Well, Valter Walker versus Mohammed Usman. The pick has to be Valter Walker, the foot hunter. Valter Walker, he's back. Do not let this guy anywhere near your legs because he will trap you in a heel hook. And they are nasty, nasty heel hooks. The looks on his opponent's faces when he gets a hold of their leg, I started cringing because I can already see I can already feel the pain that just by watching their face. I mean, Walker, he's looked amazing, right? In his recent three fights, three heel hook victories in a row. I don't think that's ever been done before. It's really impressive things we're seeing from him. And he's a big, strong man. And on top of that, he's hunting for your leg. So you already know, if he gets anywhere near your leg, he has the strength to pull it off. To do what he did to Kennedy in Juaku, I really didn't see that coming. But he pulled it off in the first minute of the fight. How can I not pick this guy to win? He's a finisher. He comes to finish fights, and 3 first round finishes in a row. And coming up against this guy, Mohammed Usman, who's been nothing but average. I think we might see Walker's 4th submission heel hook victory in a row here. Usman, he's pretty slow. He's really big, not as big as Valter, and he looks scary, but he's hesitant with his strikes. It's like he doesn't throw enough, doesn't have the greatest takedown defense, and he was getting taken down by Thomas Peterson multiple times. And when Usman lands, he obviously has some raw power to him, but I think Walter Walker moves too well to be caught with anything clean. Plus Walker he's never been finished, right? He seems really durable, and I think the footwork and movement here is going to be a big difference. Walker knows how to avoid the power punches to then close the distance in order to go for submissions or go for takedowns. He's going to be much more bigger than Usman as well, and he knows how to use his size and strength to his advantage in those clinch positions. Even if this fight stays on the feet, right? And I don't think Walter Walker is going to be a fish out of water by any means. He can definitely take care of himself in the striking, especially when facing someone as slow and hesitant as Usman. But once Walker closes the distance, the fight shifts entirely into his favor. You're in his realm. And I'm going to say Valter is going to be able to close the distance, get Usman in the clinch, throw some nasty knees up the middle, be more aggressive, get the takedowns, and find a submission. Usman's going to be looking for a big knockout shot to land, but I think Valter knows how to evade those big power punches. He moves well in evading those power punches, and that pretty much neutralizes Usman's game plan. So, on top of that, Walker, he's massive at 6'6". He moves really well for his size, agile. Obviously the dangerous leg lock threat, and his striking is improving. While Usman, he's a bit slow. He has low output. He's hittable, and he has poor defensive grappling. I think Walter is going to be able to close the distance, clinch up, and most likely heel hook another victim. Right. So moving on to our next fight. Lucas Almeida versus Michael Aswell. I'm gonna go with Michael Aswell here. So both guys, they haven't shown anything too promising in their career yet. No great performances. We saw Michael Aswell make his UFC debut. It was on short notice, I believe, versus Balaji Oki, where Aswell, he did okay in the first couple of minutes of that fight, landing some decent right hands, but eventually he got drowned by the pressure and pace of Oki. Aswell, he has some decent pop in his shots. He's pretty durable himself, and he's never been finished, and he's pretty well-rounded. Lucas Almeida is 2-3 in the UFC, most recently losing to Danny Silva. He's had more UFC level fights, but his performances haven't stood out. He's 34 years old right now. I don't think we're going to see anything new come out of his game. He's always been pretty average, and I don't see him making any drastic improvements in this next fight with Aswell. Almeida has some aggressive striking. He has a long reach to help him manage distance. But Aswell, he can strike too. I think Michael Aswell can manage with the length disadvantage he has here. He's going to be able to close the distance and mix in the wrestling, outdog Almeida. And I think Aswell has more to prove in this fight, try to establish his name in the UFC, only 25 years old, and seems like there's more upside to him. We've seen what Almeida has to offer, and it's not been too impressive. I think Aswell is tough and gritty enough to win here. Because while Almeida is a aggressive striker with a long reach, he's hittable, and he's 34 years old, not really improving, and he's always been kind of average. While Aswell, he's tough. He's well-rounded. He has that youthful energy, mixes wrestling well. into his fight. So I think as well as pressure, his mixing of levels is going to be able to get him the win here and outgrind the older veteran in this matchup, right? So moving on to our next fight, we got Ricardo Ramos versus Khan Ofli. The pick has to be Ricardo Ramos, you know? So both of these guys, you know, they pretty much always lose when they fight someone decent. You know, the difference is Ricardo Ramos has more fights in the UFC than Ofli. So he's lost to more decent opposition more often than Khan Ofli. You know, Khan Ofli has fought twice in the UFC. Two great fighters he fought. You know, he came up short versus Mohammed by decision, and he got knocked out by Marion Santos before that. Another decent fighter, you know. So clearly no notable wins for either of them. Ramos, though, he beat Ayman Zahabi back in 2017 when Ramos first entered the UFC. But other than that, hasn't had any good winnings, you know, losing to some good fighters. But Ramos isn't that bad, you know. He faces good opponents, but you know, so does Khan Ofli so far. You know, they both face good oppositions, you know. But Ricardo Ramos, yeah, he's not bad. You know, he has some nice kicks, nice spinning attacks. Did I mention I'm picking Ricardo? Yeah, I'm picking Ricardo Ramos. He has nice spinning attacks. He's been fighting smart recently, managing his distance, but doesn't really put out too much volume, and that can cost him, you know. And Khan Ofli, you know, he comes at you aggressively, puts an intense pace on you, closes the distance with his strikes, and tries to get you on the ground or grind on you against the cage and hits you with those little knees to the thighs when he has you up against the fence. But Khan Ofli, you know, when he's coming at you attempting to close the distance, he leaves himself way too open. You know, it's like his chin is right in front of you, and one clean counter and he's unconscious, you know, which is exactly what happened in his fight with Marion Santos. Santos put him to sleep, you know. That's something I really don't like about Khan Ofli. You know, his takedowns, they aren't too dominant as well. So when he closes the distance, his takedowns are defendable. You know, I'm gonna say that Ricardo Ramos does enough damage in the striking within to win minutes of this fight and stays off the fence long enough to not get taken down. You know, or if he gets held up against the fence, I believe that he's gonna be able to scramble his way out of there, right? So Ricardo Ramos, you know, he has much more experience as well, and he actually seems like a good fighter in the cage. And his losses are to pretty decent fighters. And Khan Ofli, his losses are to good fighters, but he just looks like a rookie in there, you know. Ramos has potential to finish this fight with his strikes, and even if it goes to the ground, you know, he's skilled enough to find a submission there as well. And I think he'll be able to control the pace of this fight. You know, I think Ofli will have a hard time getting a hold of Ramos. His takedowns won't be strong enough, and I think the way he pressures in his fights can leave him too vulnerable to counters, you know, which makes him look like a really low-level fighter, you know. So I'm gonna say that, you know, Ricardo Ramos, he has that veteran edge here. You know, he's got some great kicks, creative striking, and he has a solid submission game. While Ofli, you know, he has reckless pressure, poor defense, and his chin is suspect, you know. So I'm going to say Ricardo Ramos stays composed, picks him apart on the feet, or even finds a finish here. Moving on to our next fight, we got Jonathan Diniz versus Mario Pinto. I'm going to go Mario Pinto. You know, it was a tough pick, but I'm going to go Mario Pinto. You know, Mario came in to the UFC off the Contender Series with a sick knockout. You know, comes into his debut and doesn't disappoint, you know, gets another big knockout, and I'm riding with him. You know, I think he's the truth. You know, he has been hit a couple times, nothing too crazy, but I think he's durable enough. You know, his movement is good enough to evade those big shots. You know, his striking is accurate. His power is obviously there too. You know, his composure is high level for someone with the amount of experience that he has. You know, not too much experience, but he fights pretty decently, you know. He just came into the UFC and he fights like he's been at the top of the game for a while. You know, he's got a great team behind him, and he's been perfect in his pro MMA career, you know. But he's getting a good opponent here, you know, fighting Jonathan Diniz. I keep calling him Jonathan. Jonathan Diniz, who's a fellow kickboxer, you know, a pretty decent one with heavy power in his hands, good speed. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if Mario Pinto was the underdog in this matchup, because I don't know the odds yet, but because Diniz is much more proven in the UFC, but I'm leaning with Mario Pinto because he has some aura to him. They both have looked good. But Pinto has that undefeated aura. And I think he's coming into this fight with confidence. Deniz just beat a debut guy who's not UFC level, but Mario seems like the type of guy to climb the ranks. And I can't say the same for Deniz. None of them have any notable wins, but based off of their performances, I can see Pinto winning. His striking is accurate, and I see him landing at will. He can weather any storm that Deniz will present. Also, Diniz has shown some vulnerabilities in his grappling, and Pinto isn't just a striker or bust type of fighter. He can lean into his wrestling in this matchup if he has to, and Pinto is a huge guy. If he gets you in the clinch, he can be really dangerous there as well. Diniz is going to look to use his speed and pick Pinto apart from the outside, try to land that big knockout shot, and as the fight goes on, that may favor Diniz because he's gone to the decision twice in the UFC, and Pinto has been to a decision, but just not against UFC level competition. But I'm a believer in Pinto. I'm riding his hype train, and I'm a sucker for undefeated fighters. And Pinto, he's undefeated, precise striking, confident, strong in the clinch, and Diniz, while he is explosive, I think he's hittable. He's a hittable kickboxer, and his grappling is a bit suspect. So I'm gonna lean Mario Pinto, more accurate and composed, and I think he might be the better overall fighter. Coming in with momentum, I'm riding his hype with another finish, getting another knockout victory in this matchup. But it should be a good fight. It's gonna be a good fight. Moving on to the massacre of the card, we got Joel Alvarez versus Vicente Luque. Pick is Joel Alvarez, man. When Joel Alvarez fights, we tune in. This guy is an absolute monster, an exciting fighter, really well rounded. He's on a 3-fight finishing streak. Excuse me. Just got a brutal knockout on Jakar Close, I believe. Yeah, which was impressive. This guy is tearing through the division. He's 1-7. I mean, he's 7-1 in his last 8 fights, and the one loss was to Arman Tsarukyan, who was supposed to fight for the title, which is not a bad loss at all to have, against Arman. Now Joel is fighting Vicente Luque, he's 2-4 in his last 6. His 2 wins are to Themba Gorimbo and Rafael Dos Santos. These are not impressive victories whatsoever, and he's coming off of a loss to Kevin Holland, which isn't a good look at all as well. Holland, he can be hit or miss. And he just lost to Daniel Rodriguez, which wasn't a good look. So to lose to Kevin Holland by submission, it's not the greatest loss to have on your record, especially your most recent loss. And Joel Alvarez, he's a big dude. His submissions are top level, and his finishing instincts, they're elite. And like I said, a big dude compared to his opponents. His striking is efficient and is always in the fight. No matter what adversity comes his way, he's still in it. Back in the day, this fight with Vicente, it probably would have been competitive. Luque, he had some great striking. He had some really good grappling, and finishing instincts as well, but he isn't the same fighter he used to be. After getting that brain surgery or that brain bleed in his head, he's been a lot more hesitant and a lot more cautious. If he gets a chance to grab a submission, he'll go for it because he's not willing to engage in a firefight like he used to. The days we see him go to war, they're behind us, right? And it's probably a good idea to not engage in a brawl like that. Like when he fought Joaquin Buckley, he realized the striking wasn't going his way, and it looked like he kind of just gave up. Instead of taking the beating and fighting back like he used to, he said, "No, I'm just gonna take this loss. It's better for my health." And because of that brain bleed scare, I believe, and fighting someone like Joel Alvarez, he's a scary and dangerous guy, and that can definitely happen here. We can definitely see Vicente Luque quit. I don't think Luque is going to find a quick submission here. I think Joel is going to dominate the striking, and Luque would try his best to find his way out. And Alvarez, he's really long, and dangerous. They both have some good power, but the durability is definitely on Alvarez's side. I think Joel's going to tag him up and pretty much win the fight anywhere this fight goes. Luque, not as durable as he used to be. He's a veteran. He's slowed down after, you know, recently in his career after getting that brain surgery, and he's hesitant and he's declining. He's on the decline of his career, while Joe Alvarez, he's on the he's climbing up. He's going uphill in his career. Alvarez, he's tall, slick finishing, elite submissions, powerful striking. So the pick has to be Joe Alvarez. He's gonna be longer, fresher. He's gonna overwhelm Luque with a pace and his length. So I see domination from Alvarez. Moving on to our next fight, Montel Jackson versus Davison Figueiredo. I'm gonna go Montel Jackson. I'm gonna go Montel Jackson. I feel this is Montel Jackson all day. Jackson has looked pretty good recently on a 6-fight win streak. Has exceptional wrestling. Offense. He can be susceptible to be getting taken down, but we've seen him improve in his wrestling. He got taken down in his last fight a little bit versus Daniel Marcos, who he's a pretty decent prospect. Montel Jackson though, he has crazy power, long, elusive. Just beat Daniel Marcos, took his undefeated record away from him, and he's dangerous to anywhere the fight goes. He knocked out Damon Blackshear, which was a pretty decent win, and most recently gets the win over Daniel Marcos, who was a pretty good undefeated prospect coming up. This win over Figgy, who's a former champion, is definitely going to look good for him on his resume, and I think he has all the tools he needs to beat him. Figueiredo he's definitely not the same fighter he used to be. He can still compete at a high level, but when it comes to elite fighters, he can't compete with them anymore, and we don't know if Montel Jackson can be considered an elite fighter, but I definitely think he has potential to be one. Since moving up to bantamweight, Figueiredo, look who he beat. He beat Rob Font, who's an old man everyone is beating on nowadays. He beat Cody Garbrandt, another washed fighter that everyone is beating on, and Chito Vera, a non-elite level fighter. And then after that, Peter Yan beats him with in which is it's a decent loss to have on your record. Yan is an elite fighter, but then also after that he lost to Corey Sandhagen, and not to take anything away from Corey Sandhagen, he's a great fighter, but Figueiredo, in my opinion, he looked so bad in that fight. It was his most recent fight. I didn't realize how bad he looked until I rewatched that fight not too long ago. In the first round he did okay. He took Corey down like twice, which was impressive, and he also landed a couple nice right hands. But after that, when Corey took him down, it's like he just laid there for so long. Same thing in the second round. He showed no urgency to get back up to his feet, no real attempts at getting out of that position. He kind of just accepted defeat, but then his knee popped out of place. And personally, at first, I thought he was faking the injury because of how much he was getting controlled in the second round, and yeah, he just wanted to give up. But I guess he really did pop his knee out. I'm not sure though. I wasn't impressed with that performance. Plus, he's getting old, himself. 37 years old, not fighting another older fighter in this matchup. He's fighting someone who's much younger, hungrier, in their prime, who's been kind of climbing up the division. It's hard to think Montel won't win here. He'll be much taller. He'll be much more athletic, much younger and faster and sharper. And Montel, he's well-rounded. We saw how hard it was to take him down. His balance and hip mobility he showed in his last fight with Daniel Marcos was really impressive. He did get taken down sometimes, but he was quick to get back up. Marcos was trying his absolute best to take him down, and he struggled a lot at times. He did take him down multiple times throughout the fight, but Montel was quick to get right back up. And from range, Montel was landing jabs and leg kicks, putting up the more damage. I think having that long reach in this fight, Montel is going to be too skilled at range, picking Figgy apart, landing some nice power shots on the feet, keeping the fight standing, and even landing his own takedowns, if he has to. Davison Figueiredo, he has some solid power, but against guys who are actually good nowadays, he has a hard time landing. In his most recent fights, Figgy is going to come forward and try to push the pace and put the pressure on. But Montel, is really composed under pressure, and he can handle that, using his length to his advantage and staying at range, picking him apart. That pressure might work against Figueiredo in this matchup, because I could see Jackson winning this fight pretty much anywhere it goes, striking from range or landing his own takedowns, avoiding the big power shots of Figgy, making Figgy chase him and miss. Because Montel, he has like that rangy style, it's hard to close a distance on him or land on him, and I see Montel being dangerous everywhere, including in the clinch, being much taller. He's going to have those knees up the middle as well. So, you know, using his length, how tall he is compared to Davison Figueiredo, he's going to be much more powerful, composed, and he's like a wrestler. He's primarily a wrestler, and he has that boxing to back it up as well. He's improving every fight, and against Figueiredo, who's aging and slower and struggling against athletic, rangy fighters like Montel Jackson, who's on the come up, while Davis Figueiredo is on a downhill trend. The pick has to be Montel Jackson. I think he's going to dominate him at range, mix in the takedowns, and win this fight clearly. I see domination from Montel Jackson. So moving on to our next fight, we got the main event of the evening: Charles Oliveira versus Mateusz Gamrot. This was such a tough pick, but I'm gonna go with Mateusz Gamrot, and the reason why is because, look, Oliveira, he has some elite grappling, but he usually comes forward with a ton of pressure in his striking, and all that coming forward leaves him vulnerable to being hit and countered in every fight. I feel like if Mateusz Gamrot, someone as tough as Mateusz Gamrot, counters you and hits you and lands clean, he's instantly just going to go dive in for a takedown. And with all that pressure that Charles Oliveira is going to come forward with, Mateusz Gamrot can just duck under and grab a takedown, but this is a big test for Gamrot. If he gets past Charles, he's going to start being in the talks for a contender that's next in line for a title shot. Maybe he needs another win after this, but a win here over Charles will really help his case of being a serious contender. And if you look at Oliveira's losses recently, they're to the absolute best fighters in the division. The absolute best fighters the division has to offer: Islam Makhachev, Ilia Topuria, two fighters considered to be pound for pound number one right now, and also lost to Arman Tsarukyan, who was recently supposed to fight for a title but got injured. Like the guys that Charles Oliveira is losing to, elite competition. I think all those guys that beat Oliveira, they can for sure beat up Mateusz Gamrot as well. So in that fight that Gamrot most recently lost to Dan Hooker, he kind of just showed that his game plan is to come forward, throw punches only to set up the takedowns. His game plan is to get the takedowns. It's a safe and smart strategy. And that's pretty much how Oliveira kind of loses. With Islam, he got hit with a left hook and then submitted. With Arman, he got taken down. Arman splits his face open with an elbow. There was a moment in the first round where Oliveira was on top. Arman was able to reverse position and ends up on top, and with Ilia just straight up knocked him out. But the thing about Oliveira is that he gets dropped in every fight he's in. If you can land a clean power shot, you can definitely drop Oliveira or even wobble him. And after that, you can take him down. Oliveira was finding success, in gathering up takedowns in his fight versus Michael Chandler. He pretty much ragdolled Chandler for the first 4 rounds, but Chandler isn't on the level as Gamrot in wrestling, and even Chandler was close to finishing Oliveira in the 5th round of their second fight with a flurry of punches. Oliveira gets hit too easily. If you land on him, you're gonna rock him and you can take him down, which is pretty much what Gamrot's game plan is. And a part of me thinks that Oliveira is going to land a sick left hook and follow up with punches to finish the fight, because Oliveira can be so slick sometimes. But I think Gamrot is at a high enough level to land the punches he needs to land in order to set up his takedowns and maintain the top control. Like I said before, Oliveira, he has some elite grappling, but he usually just comes forward with a ton of pressure in his striking, and all that coming forward leaves him vulnerable to being hit and countered in every fight, which is why he's on his back for so many moments in this fight. And if Mateusz Gamrot is on top of you, that's going to be a really tough challenge to deal with. Oliveira, he's going to come forward, be aggressive with his striking, try to land a big shot, and he might land it, and I feel there will be a lot of scrambles in this fight. You know, someone's gonna get rocked. And the other person is going to be looking for submissions in the scrambles, but I do think Gamrot will be able to pressure Oliveira back enough to land his own takedowns, you know, put up some overwhelming volume on the feet. Gamrot also has great submission defense, which is something he's definitely going to need here as well, versus Charles. And not to mention, Oliveira just got knocked the F out like 4 months ago. This is a really quick turnaround for him. You mean to tell me that he was sparring for this fight shortly after getting brutally knocked out by Topuria, getting some serious head trauma from Topuria? Like it was a terribly scary knockout. You know, Oliveira had his eyes open and rolled back. Like, he shouldn't be sparring, getting ready to fight again for at least 6 months to a year, you know, at the very least. And I'd be impressed if Charles was able to pull this off. But, you know, my mind says Gamrot and my heart is saying Oliveira. I got to go with my mind in this matchup. And because all that forward pressure that Oliveira is going to do, it might work against him here. Mateusz Gamrot can shoot under, get a takedown, and even rock Oliveira coming in and then pursue the takedown, because he's a relentless wrestler. Gamrot, he has strong top control, elite scrambles as well, decent submission defense. And while Charles Oliveira, you know, he has dangerous subs, he's so hittable. You know, he has reckless entries at times, and it's such a quick turnaround for him from his last fight. So I'm gonna say Mateusz Gamrot avoids the chaos, he wrestles smart and grinds out a decision victory here. So one second. Oh, right. So yeah, that's my prediction. I'm going Mateusz Gamrot to win this fight. Moving on to our goodbye slide. That does conclude my picks for this week's UFC card. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know who you are rolling with. Drop your predictions down below and let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks. And I'd love to see what you guys thought. You know, as always, hope you're doing well. Hope you guys have a great day. And I love you guys. That's it for me. I'm out. Peace.